The motion sensor chimed at 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. David Chen, a 42-year-old emergency room physician who worked brutal 12-hour overnight shifts, stood at his bedroom window and watched 5 teenagers vault his 6-foot privacy fence like it was an Olympic event. 3 months. For 3 solid months, he'd come home exhausted from saving lives only to find his saltwater pool transformed into a garbage dump, his expensive pool furniture broken, and his property treated like a free-for-all entertainment zone. The police had been useless, citing insufficient evidence despite his complaints. His neighbors claimed they'd seen nothing, but today was different. Today, David wasn't just another exhausted homeowner begging for respect. Today, he had a plan that would turn their entitled paradise into their worst nightmare. Before we dive into how David turned these pool crashers into trembling apologizers, if you love stories where entitled people finally face real consequences and justice gets served ice cold, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a dedicated doctor past his breaking point, the confrontation where 5 cocky teenagers realized they'd been playing games with the wrong person, and the resolution where a simple chemistry trick delivered justice so perfect it became neighborhood legend. In the first part, you'll experience David's descent from patient professional to calculated strategist as months of disrespect and property destruction finally shattered his faith in the system. You'll feel his rage building as these kids laughed at his attempts to reason with them, mocked his calls to their parents, and escalated their violations until something precious was destroyed beyond repair. In the second part, witness the moment David revealed he knew everything about them, their full names, their parents' identities, their schools, their vulnerabilities, and watch their smug confidence crumble into genuine fear. The power shift was instant and absolute. And in the final part, discover how a simple pool chemical trick, combined with perfect timing, created a moment of terror these teenagers would never forget, leading to consequences that rippled through 3 different families and one very smug doctor finally getting his peace back. Here's exactly how it happened. David Chen had worked at County General Hospital for 15 years, building a reputation as the doctor who never lost his cool under pressure. Trauma cases, cardiac arrests, mass casualty events, nothing rattled him. He'd bought his house in the quiet Riverside Oaks subdivision specifically for the large backyard and the privacy it offered. After years of apartment living and hospital chaos, he'd saved for a decade to afford this place. The saltwater pool had been his dream, a $30,000 investment he'd installed himself over 6 months, learning plumbing and electrical work on YouTube just to make it perfect. It wasn't just recreation. It was therapy. After watching people suffer and sometimes lose their lives, floating in that warm water under the stars helped him decompress, helped him sleep, helped him stay human in a job that often felt inhuman. He lived alone, worked nights, and kept to himself. The perfect target, apparently, for entitled kids who thought empty houses meant free entertainment. The first incident happened in late June. David had come home at 8 in the morning, after a particularly brutal shift involving a multi-vehicle accident. 3 people hadn't made it. He was physically and emotionally destroyed, desperate for his pool routine to wash away the night's horrors. Instead, he found beer cans floating in the water, chip bags scattered across his deck, and his expensive teak lounge chair snapped in half. Someone had apparently tried to use it as a diving board. The pool water was cloudy with sunscreen and what looked like soda. He'd stood there in his scrubs, still smelling like antiseptic and exhaustion, and felt something crack inside his chest. His sanctuary had been violated. He'd called the police, filed a report, and spent 4 hours cleaning and rebalancing the pool chemistry before he could finally, mercifully, pass out. 3 weeks later, It happened again. This time they'd been bolder. David's security camera, which he'd installed after the first incident, showed 5 teenagers scaling his fence at 2 in the afternoon. They'd brought a Bluetooth speaker that blasted music for hours. They'd raided his pool storage shed, using his expensive pool toys and leaving them destroyed. His custom pool net, a $200 item, was found at the bottom of the pool, torn completely in half. Worst of all, someone had urinated in his pool. The security footage was grainy, too distant to identify faces clearly, just body types and clothing. When David showed it to the police, the officer had shrugged. Kids being kids, can't make out faces, can't press charges. Maybe install a better lock. David had upgraded to a 8-foot fence. They'd climbed it the following week. The third incident broke something in David that the hospital had never managed to touch. He came home to find his late mother's ceramic garden gnome, a silly thing she'd given him the Christmas before she passed. The one item he'd placed poolside because it made him smile, shattered into pieces across the concrete. They'd used it for target practice, apparently, throwing pool chemicals at it until it exploded. Surrounding the destruction were 2 empty bottles of his expensive chlorine shock treatment, dumped carelessly into his pool, turning the water a murky, chemical-burned mess that would take days and hundreds of dollars to fix. David had stood there with pieces of his mother's gift in his hands and felt something fundamental shift. The hospital had taught him that some injuries couldn't be fixed with kindness. Some required aggressive intervention. He'd tried calling the one-parent number he'd managed to track down by following a teenager home one day. The mother had laughed. Actually laughed. "Boys will be boys," she'd said. "Maybe if you were home more, they'd know someone lived there." When David mentioned legal action, she'd hung up. His direct confrontation had gone worse. He'd waited by the fence one afternoon and stepped out when they arrived. "This is private property," he'd said, keeping his voice steady and professional. The ringleader, a tall kid with bleached hair, had looked him up and down and smirked. "What are you gonna do about it, old man? Call the cops again? They don't care." The others had laughed. One had made a mocking gesture. David had retreated inside, humiliated and furious, while they'd partied in his pool for 3 more hours. That night, David stopped being the victim. He'd spent 15 years learning how human bodies worked, how chemistry affected biological systems, how pressure points, physical and psychological, could change everything in seconds. If the system wouldn't help him, he'd help himself. He began his research. Using his hospital connections and some careful social media investigation, he identified all 5 teenagers within a week. More importantly, he learned their schedules, their parents' workplaces, and one crucial detail. 3 of the 5 were sons of prominent local figures. The bleached-hair ringleader was Connor Matthews, 17, son of City Councilman Robert Matthews. That changed everything. David spent the next 2 weeks acquiring supplies, setting up better cameras, and learning about pool chemistry in ways his initial installation had never required. If they wanted to play games, he'd show them what games really looked like. And on August 15th, the teenagers arrived at 2:30 p.m., right on schedule. David watched from his bedroom window as they vaulted the fence with practiced ease, laughing and shoving each other. Connor went first, already pulling off his shirt. The others followed. Tyler, Mason, Brandon, and Jake, all between 16 and 18, all convinced they were untouchable. They didn't notice that the pool water looked slightly different today, still crystal clear but with a faint amber tint. They definitely didn't notice David slipping out his back door and quietly locking the gate they'd left open behind them. "Gentlemen," David said, stepping into view. His voice was calm, the same tone he used in the ER when delivering bad news. "I think we need to have a conversation." The teenagers spun around. Connor's smirk appeared instantly. "Dude, we told you to chill. It's just a pool." David pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Immediately, a small pump hidden in his pool shed hummed to life. Within seconds, the crystal-clear water began changing. First pink, then deeper red, then a dark crimson that looked disturbingly like the trauma bay after a major incident. The teenagers froze, watching in horror as the pool transformed into what looked like a scene from a horror movie. "What the—" Tyler started. "That's concentrated red dye number 40 mixed with a pH indicator," David interrupted, his voice still eerily calm. "Completely harmless. Washes off in a few days. But it photographs beautifully, don't you think?" He held up his phone, snapping pictures of their shocked faces, their feet already stained red from the pool deck where the chemical-treated water had splashed. "Now let me tell you what else I have. Connor James Matthews, 17, son of Councilman Robert Matthews, student at Riverside High varsity soccer player, currently applying to UC Berkeley. Tyler Harrison, 16, son of Police Sergeant Linda Harrison, yes, that Harrison, student at the same school, planning to apply to the police academy. Mason Price, 18, already on probation for shoplifting, lives with his grandmother Patricia Price on Elm Street because your parents couldn't handle you anymore." "Brandon, how do you know all this?" Connor's voice had lost its cocky edge, replaced by something that sounded like fear. David smiled, but it wasn't friendly. It was the smile he used when a difficult patient finally understood their diagnosis was serious. "I'm an ER doctor. I have access to hospital records. I have colleagues in every school, every department, every office in this city. And I have 3 months of documentation proving you've trespassed, destroyed property, and created a public nuisance. The security footage I showed the police before? That was the bad camera. The good cameras are hidden. I have crystal clear footage of every single one of your faces." He swiped through his phone, showing them screenshots. Their faces went pale as they recognized themselves in perfect HD clarity. "Here's how this works," David continued, pocketing his phone. "Option 1, I call your parents right now. All of them. Then I file formal charges: criminal trespassing, destruction of property, vandalism. I have documentation of $12,000 in damages. That's felony level in this state. I contact UC Berkeley's admissions office, the police academy, and Mason, I call your probation officer. Your grandmother will be devastated, by the way. She thinks you're volunteering at the community center on Tuesday afternoons." The teenagers stood frozen, red water dripping from their swim trunks, leaving crimson footprints on the concrete. Jake looked like he might cry. Connor's jaw was clenched so tight David could see the muscles jumping. "Option 2, David said softly. "You fix everything. Every single thing. You have 48 hours. You'll replace my lounge chair, teak, weather-resistant, the exact model I had. You'll replace my pool net, my pool toys, every item you've destroyed. You'll clean this pool completely, drain it, refill it, rebalance the chemicals. You'll repair the fence section you damaged climbing over. You'll replant the flowers you trampled. Total cost, approximately $8,000, which you'll split 5 ways. And you'll do all the labor yourselves. We don't have that kind of money," Tyler protested. David's expression didn't change. "Then you'll get jobs. Mow lawns, wash cars. I don't care. You had money for beer and whatever else you've been bringing to my pool. Find it. You have 48 hours. If the work isn't completed to my satisfaction by Friday at 6 p.m., I proceed with option 1. And gentlemen," he leaned forward slightly, "I have video of today's little pool dye incident, too. Imagine explaining to your parents why you're covered in red dye in some strange man's pool. Imagine that photo circulating online. Riverside High's social media would have a field day." Connor opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "This is blackmail." David laughed, a short, sharp sound. "No, this is consequences. I asked you nicely to stop. You mocked me. I called your parents. They dismissed me. I called the police. They did nothing. So I'm giving you a chance to make this right before it becomes a legal matter. That's more generous than you've been to me for 3 months. And Connor, Your father's re-election campaign just sent out mailers about family values and raising responsible children. Imagine the opposition research value of his son facing criminal charges. The silence stretched for almost a minute. Finally, Connor nodded, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. Fine, we'll do it. David pulled out a typed list from his back pocket. Here's everything that needs to be replaced or repaired, with links to the exact products and expected completion checklist. You start tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. I'll be watching. And gentlemen, the red dye, it's going to stain your skin for about 3 days. Every time someone asks what happened, you'll have to explain. Consider it a preview of the embarrassment that comes with option 1. They left through the gate David unlocked for them. 5 teenagers who'd arrived cocky and entitled now shuffling out stained red and silent, carrying their clothes in their hands because putting them on would just spread the dye. Connor turned back once at the gate, and David saw calculation in his eyes. Don't even think about it, David said quietly. I have cameras everywhere now. Any retaliation attempt gets added to the evidence file. Try me. Connor looked away first. David watched them leave, then smiled for the first time in weeks. The pool water was already beginning to clear as the dye diluted and dispersed. He'd timed it perfectly. Friday morning arrived with David sitting on his newly repaired deck, drinking coffee and watching 5 exhausted teenagers put the final touches on his restored pool area. They'd started Wednesday at dawn, and he'd made them redo sections 3 times when the work wasn't perfect. At 5:30 p.m., just as they were finishing the final chemical balance test on the freshly cleaned pool, a silver BMW pulled into David's driveway. Councilman Robert Matthews stepped out, his face a storm cloud of fury. He stormed into the backyard, taking in the scene. His son covered in sweat and pool chemicals, 4 other exhausted teenagers, and David sitting calmly with his coffee. You, Matthews pointed at David, you think you can blackmail my son? David didn't stand up. Your son trespassed on my property repeatedly for 3 months, destroyed $12,000 worth of equipment and peace of mind, and you did nothing when I called. I gave him a chance to make it right. He took it. No charges filed, no police involved, just consequences and restitution. He pulled out his phone and swiped through the security footage. Would you like to see the evidence before you make accusations? Or would you prefer I send this to the local news? I hear they love stories about public officials whose children operate above the law. Matthews watched the footage, his face cycling through anger, recognition, and resignation. He turned to Connor. Is this true? All of it? Connor couldn't meet his father's eyes. He nodded. Matthews was quiet for a long moment, then looked at David. What's been done to make this right? David handed him the itemized list. Everything's been replaced or repaired. The work is completed. Your son and his friends have learned an expensive lesson about property rights and consequences. I consider the matter closed, provided it never happens again. Matthews studied the list, then his son. You're grounded until Christmas. Your car is sold. The money goes to reimburse your friends' families for their shares. You'll get a job to pay me back your portion, and you'll personally apologize to Dr. Chen. Connor's face went white, but he turned to David. I'm sorry. We were wrong. It won't happen again. The words were stiff, humiliated, but genuine enough. David nodded. Accepted. Gentlemen, you're free to go. The teenagers left quickly, Matthews following with one last look at David that carried grudging respect mixed with lingering anger. As their cars pulled away, David's neighbor, Margaret, appeared at the fence line. I saw the whole thing, she said quietly. I should have spoken up before. I'm sorry. Within a week, 2 other neighbors had approached David privately to thank him. Apparently, the same teenagers had been causing problems throughout the subdivision, and his solution had made them heroes in multiple households. One neighbor even admitted they'd been too afraid of Matthews's political influence to complain. The story spread through Riverside Oaks like wildfire, though the details got progressively more exaggerated. By the time David heard the 10th retelling, he'd apparently turned the pool into actual blood and called in SWAT teams. 2 months later, David floated in his pristine pool under a clear October sky, finally feeling the peace he'd fought so hard to reclaim. The water was perfect, the equipment was actually better than before, and his fence had a new lock system that would stop a determined cat burglar. Connor Matthews had gotten a job at a local grocery store. Tyler Harrison had been rejected from the Police Academy summer program after the incident went into his record. Mason's grandmother had apparently grounded him so thoroughly that he was seen only at school and work for 6 months. David had seen Connor once since then, pumping gas at the station where David filled up. The teenager had ducked his head, suddenly very interested in his shoes, and David had simply nodded and moved on. There was no need to gloat. The lesson had been taught and received. As David lay there watching stars appear in the darkening sky, he thought about the hospital, about the countless times he'd taught young residents that medicine wasn't about dominance, it was about calculated intervention at the right moment with the right pressure. Sometimes justice didn't come from courtrooms or police reports. Sometimes it came from refusing to accept victimhood and understanding exactly what pressure points to apply. He'd learned in the ER that some situations required aggressive treatment, and he'd applied those same principles to 5 entitled teenagers who'd thought empty houses meant free entertainment. As he closed his eyes and let the warm water hold him, David Chen smiled. Because justice, whether served in an emergency room or a suburban backyard, was always more satisfying when you delivered it yourself. Across the country in Portland, Oregon, retired Marine Colonel Patricia Hayes was trimming her roses when her HOA president demanded she remove the small memorial garden she'd built for fallen soldiers. Patricia set down her pruning shears slowly, the same deliberate movement that once preceded tactical decisions, and smiled at the man who thought a clipboard gave him authority over a woman who'd commanded battalions. "Please," she said quietly. "Keep talking. I'd love to know who thinks they can bully a decorated veteran off her own property while standing on a garden bed that violates 3 different city ordinances I helped." "Right!" The president's confident expression.